for Girard, humans are fundamentally mimetic or imitative, right? And this has many aspects of importance to how we learn language, how we learn different things, because we are basically copycats, right? But it also means that things like violence have the potential to spread contagiously.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and Marlo.
Today, we're joined by Geoff Shullenberger, a clinical associate professor in the expository writing program at New York University and a columnist at Compact. And Geoff is joining us today to discuss the recent tragedy that took place in Texas, where a gunman shot and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. The tragedy revived calls for gun control, but also highlighted a pervasive spiritual rot that seems to be behind these incidents, which Geoff has written about and will speak with us further about today. So thanks for joining us, Geoff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we get started with our interview, I'd like to thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Geoff, you had an interesting angle in your recent piece following the recent mass shooting about human sacrifice and how this regressive practice is somewhat replicated in not only the mass shooting, but also the ritual act that follows in American culture. Could you start by explaining this idea to our listeners who haven't read your piece?
Sure. So first of all, I didn't, sort of coin this way of reading it. I was partly commenting on some other writers who had sort of invoked this notion of human sacrifice in recent weeks. One was Maureen Dowd in the New York Times, and then there was also a piece in the Baffler, the left-wing journal, that sort of invoked this notion. And so, I was trying to both, accept part of this framing while also, I think, shifting the way it's being used. So the standard way that these previous pieces have done it is to say something like, there's this cult. I mean, these are, again, liberal commentators, so it fits into an argument for gun control. The idea is essentially the gun has become a kind of god or fetish object, and so these sacrifices are proof of our sort of irrational attachment to this cult, supposedly, as a culture. So I think there's part of this argument that resonates with my own interest in the sort of historical phenomenon of human sacrifice, as well as various thinkers like René Girard and Georges Bataille in particular, and also Roberto Calasso, who have all written compellingly on the subject. And basically, the things that this phenomenon of mass shootings does have in common with human sacrifice is that it, interestingly, there was just as an example, there was a recent discovery of a large number of hundreds of skulls in Mexico. And it was initially assumed to be, one of these murders carried out by a drug cartel. But then it was proven that the skeletal remains are actually far older, right? And so they were the remains of some kind of sacrificial ritual. So whenever we find out about incidents like this, like through archaeological discoveries, they tend to be shocking and seem, just irrational and impossible to account for, right, according to our own understanding of things. And so I think, in the basic way that we respond as spectators to these incidents, we experience a certain kind of incomprehension, right? And that's, I'd say, universal, right? Regardless of where we are. I think all of us, when these kind of incidents occur, they seem fundamentally irrational and inexplicable, right? Because they are acts of, mass violence, as often human sacrifice was, that, don't seem to serve any purpose, right? In other words, the person, it's not somebody, because they're a criminal carrying out a killing, as part of their, criminal activities. It's not somebody who, or it's not the state carrying out, some kind of killing as part of its monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, to use that concept. Instead, it's this, violence that seems to serve no purpose, right? That seems to be, and seems to be fundamentally inexplicable for that reason. It's not part of war. It's not part of any kind of criminal phenomenon. It's just pure violence for its own sake, right? And so that, I think, is the basic way that that they're correct to see a kind of link to human sacrifice, right? So the thing that I think they're wrong about is that the gun does not really fully explain this phenomenon as a specific cultural phenomenon, right? Because while it has occurred elsewhere in the world, it is far more frequent in the United States. And there are countries that are more violent than the United States that have as many guns. That's hard to say, but certainly as many guns, let's say, in regular use, that are very violent parts of the world, and parts of the Middle East or Latin America, that have larger numbers of murders, let's say, but they don't really experience exactly this phenomenon, right? So this phenomenon seems to be, even if it's not completely specific to the U.S., it is the particular way that it happens is largely an American phenomenon. And that cannot be simply explained by the presence of guns, right? There are some other things that have happened here. And so what I set out to do in the column, I think, was try to give an account of this relationship to human sacrifice, specifically through the idea of sacrifice as something that is, and this comes from the work of Georges Bataille, who's really the philosopher who most kind of drew modern thinking back to the question of human sacrifice, right? Which sort of during the Enlightenment had been, begun to be regarded as just kind of barbaric and meaningless, and then was also interestingly engaged with in Christian theology before that, but also seen as superseded by Christ's passion, which is sort of presented as the end of sacrifice, right? And so what I tried to do is connect this phenomenon to the fact that by many accounts there is some function that sacrifice fulfills, right? That in cultures, and that it can take a great variety of different forms, not necessarily as bloody or horrifying as this one, that we have in some way lost any understanding of, right? And so this phenomenon seems to have erupted into our culture as a kind of return of this repressed element that has been present in many human cultures throughout history, and they used to be very central to how many of these cultures, including Christian culture, thought about the world, but that has become largely something we just see as irrational and barbaric. And that's not to say that it isn't irrational and barbaric, but I think there is a logic that is worth trying to understand. So
I'm glad you mentioned René Girard, because I read this piece like several years ago about by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker about kind of the copycat effect of these shootings, which maybe you've read as well. Specifically, he points to like group behavior and how it takes, especially after Columbine, that kind of set off this effect where they kind of had this hero worship of the two shooters. And it's interesting. I mean, I kind of linked what Gladwell was theorizing there and kind of my impression of his piece to René Girard and kind of his concept of mimesis. So I'd be interested in hearing about, what you think, how maybe mimesis and contagion have a role, or maybe we can analyze it through that Girardian lens when we look at like not only mass shootings, but maybe even COVID. So like, do you have any thoughts on how we can apply that framework to, since we're on the topic of shootings, mass shootings, maybe that's more applicable here?
Yes. So that Gladwell piece was, similarly made an impression on me, and, offered an interesting analysis, which, while not directly indebted to Girard, was in many ways convergent with many of his accounts of how, violence is contagious, right? So basically, for Girard, humans are fundamentally mimetic or imitative, right? And this has many, it has many aspects of importance to how we learn, language, how we learn different things, because we are basically copycats, right? But it also means that things like violence have the potential to spread contagiously, right? And so, we can see what this looks like in the context of and so the theory that that Gladwell draws on, which I also discussed in a piece for Tablet magazine called Human Sacrifice and the Digital Business Model, which is kind of thinking about these arguments in relation to online mobs and pylons and things like that, which is another way that I've kind of used these ideas. But I also linked this to the sociologist who Gladwell discusses, whose name is Mark Granovetter, who has this notion of a threshold, and basically he was analyzing what happens sociologically in riots, and the idea was essentially that most people have a relatively high threshold before they will engage in some kind of radically antisocial behavior, whether it's throwing a brick through a window, in the context of setting riots, or lighting a building on fire or whatever, or beating someone up, right? So the idea is the majority of people have a relatively high threshold that they have to kind of get over in order to engage in any of these kinds of normally sanctioned behaviors. And so the idea of the threshold theory is that in a context like a riot, because it assembles together a large number of people who have different levels of sort of resistance to engaging in this kind of activity, the people who have the lowest threshold, right, who can most easily switch over into engaging in this kind of activity, can then become the models of the people who have a slightly higher threshold, who, because they see other people doing it, will sort of mimetically replicate their behavior, and so on and so forth, until you get to the people who would be very unlikely to do it unless they had many examples of other people doing it prior to them, right? In other words, we could say the people who are most mimetic or imitative, which would be the majority of people, versus the people who are a little bit more, willing to go out on a limb, let's say. And so Gladwell argues that something like this has happened in a more diffuse way with mass shootings, because as they have, they've become a self-perpetuating phenomenon, because as they have become more frequent, that leads to them becoming even more frequent, because it means that more and more people who might have some, predisposition in that direction have more and more examples to follow, right? And so that allows them to overcome the high threshold separating them from these events, right? So in other words, another way to put this is, as they become culturally pervasive, they become self-perpetuating, right? And so, the other thing that I think is interesting here, and so, going back to my argument about human sacrifice, which is obviously, again, a kind of action or ritual that is largely looked at with horror, right, among sort of modern people. On the other hand, we have the fact that, and I would argue that the shooters themselves, in many cases, seem to at least intuitively understand what they're doing sacrificially, right? And in many cases, they are deliberately sacrificing themselves. In other words, they are engaging in this act with the understanding that they will be killed in the process, or in some cases committing suicide after they complete it. But regardless, another way that they are mimetic, and that this kind of sacrificial activity is mimetic, is that they often, and Gladwell discusses this at length, they will often idolize the previous shooters, right? So in other words, they will have, and this is one of the most well-documented phenomena, right? That the people who do this always intensively study the examples of the previous people who have done it, right? And so it really functions in this mimetic way, right? So Girard, I should add, and then I'll, I think I've covered this point, but Girard, sees sacrifice as a kind of culmination of a mimetic process. So it's essentially something that, both culminates the kind of escalation of violence, but he argues in a sort of ritualized form in a culture in which it is accepted. The reason that it is accepted is because it brings about some kind of cathartic closure to this process, right? So it allows for this violence to kind of reach a climax and then be contained, at least temporarily, right? But then, of course, the sacrifice has to be repeated periodically, because the sort of mimetic conflict continues to build up, right? So it has to be repeated in order to periodically kind of, again, bring this violence to a climax, which in a sense allows for a kind of cathartic resolution of it. So this, for Girard, is how sacrifice functioned in archaic cultures. Obviously today, it's a little more complicated, but what's strange is that, this pattern is similarly kind of ritualized, it's periodic. It seems to, it comes in lulls and then bursts. It sort of, there are these sort of build-ups towards it, and then it kind of explodes, and then there's a sort of brief period of impact, and then gradually things gather towards the next event. So what's strange is that, there's not any kind of, deliberate coordination here, but nevertheless, this pattern has somehow reproduced itself.
Geoff, I'm curious, in terms of the cultural influences that might be at play. I think, conservatives have rightly pointed out some of the family-related issues that could perhaps make someone more disposed to this type of behavior, in particular, the individual's relationship with their father, or lack of relationship, or potentially an abusive relationship. You also see in this recent case sort of a hatred of women and some incel type behavior. Perhaps the shooter was involved in sort of some dark corners of the internet where they were talking frequently about violence against women. So I'm curious to what extent you see culture, specifically the culture of the family and the breakdown of the family, playing a wider role in some of these shootings.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there has been some, there has been some study that there's at least a pattern of a sort of missing father, or some kind of familial sort of disruption, right? But on the other hand, that's obviously very widespread. These events are both spectacular and in statistical terms relatively rare, right? In relation to, say, the number of people who have those types of backgrounds. So I think that offers part of an explanation, but not a sufficient one. But I would say that again, kind of drawing on Girard, part of his and this is a little bit abstract, but part of what he thinks leads to a kind of social destabilization is a kind of dismantling or scrambling of sort of hierarchies, right? So in other words, essentially that he argues that stability in social settings tends to come from some degree of hierarchy that is relatively fixed, right? And so that would mean, within the family having a certain sense of, a pecking order, or basically a sort of paternal authority, and a maternal authority of some sort as well, and within the society at large, it just means some sense of having some kind of relatively fixed place within it, right? So his argument is that societies have organized themselves this way for a reason, right? Which is that it limits conflict, right? Because when authority is sort of vertically organized that way, it's relatively rare that conflict will proliferate on that kind of vertical axis, right? Whereas on a horizontal axis, where you have people who are essentially in the same position or see themselves as being in the same position as others, there's a much greater sense of, or potential for, instability. And so, I think that's certainly a way that, this kind of theory would, again, in a sort of abstract form, suggest that there's this kind of, potential not just for violence, but for a kind of spiritual disorder, or just, generalized sense of dislocation, right, and alienation that comes out of this kind of breakdown. And beyond that, I think it's interesting, again, from a sort of mimetic point of view, that these kids, they are casting out, they're not looking up vertically at some model, right? Whether it's a father or some community figure or whatever, they're looking out horizontally to, essentially people they can see as peers, right? And the people they sort of select as their models are these other, these other shooters, right? Which is, it is quite a disturbing phenomenon, but it's not entirely out of keeping with the general way that there's been a kind of shift towards this horizontal axis of identification, we might say. In other words, that when we kind of devalue this more kind of vertical axis of identification, right? Where instead of looking up to some kind of elder or figure who projects some sort of authority. We look to the side. This is where a potential for these sort of things emerges, again in a sort of abstract sense, if that makes sense.
Another, I think, observation conservatives have made, besides the observation that a lot of school shooters do come from, broken households, disrupted families, maybe abusive, they have abusive relationships, is kind of the absence of religion, and how perhaps, the void that is there without God has kind of created a nihilism and almost an existential rage in a lot of these young men who, do carry out these violent and heinous acts. And you identify the spiritual hollowness in your piece that you say is at the core of American empire. So how do you think that maybe that's a more abstract question than simply identifying, a family figure as being kind of the glue that holds together, someone's upbringing that may make them perhaps less likely to carry out something like this? And absolutely by no means do all people who come from broken households end up, this, like you mentioned earlier, this is a spectacular and, statistically, it is not common for that to occur. But school shootings do, unfortunately, there have been several mass shootings over the past few weeks alone. So what do you think is the role of religion in here? Do you think that conservatives have kind of the right idea when the family and the lack of any type of, spiritual glue kind of holding young men, especially, and grounding them is absent, and maybe that's leading to some of these adverse behaviors and violent behaviors for that matter?
So my argument, which again may be the more controversial part of the piece, is that mass shooters have created a kind of substitute religion. And I think the best evidence for this is that they often themselves appear to see it this way. That they, often, I mentioned before that, there's a great deal of evidence that they look kind of mimetically for models to these other previous shooters, but that they also kind of, you can find, there are like these shrines that have been created basically on the internet to these previous shooters, whether it's the Columbine shooters or Elliot Rodger or others. And so there is this kind of cult of martyrdom, we might say. And, usually what's discussed in relation to these actions, or often in many cases what's discussed when it's not the idea that this is fundamentally about, guns, is that there's a, there's a set of ideological commitments that the shooter will evince in some way, and then that's kind of adduced as the explanation, right? But the way I see it is, if you abstract what shooters may have said or not said about what they're doing, what seems to be most remarkable is the similarity of these events, regardless of what their kind of ideological outlook is. And I'd say that's because it's kind of this self-referential cult, right, where basically the fundamental commitment is to this kind of act, right? And, whatever kind of ideology gets attached to that might be seen as more secondary, or at least that's the argument I'm making. And that would explain why, people of all different persuasions or no evident persuasion whatsoever, as in, for example, the case of the Las Vegas shooting, right, which is still the largest, but we have no idea what the motive was in any kind of ideological or political sense, is that, that there's a willingness to die in order to commit this particular type of act, right? And so that, again, suggests a kind of an almost sacred value being placed on this type of act, right? Which is a horrifying thought, obviously, but, if we look to the history of sacrificial religion, this is not an unusual phenomenon, right? In fact, we can find archaeological evidence of it on every continent, right? So this is not rare in human history, in fact, right? That people will see, this kind of what seems to us gratuitous slaughter as a kind of sacred action. So I think that, again, the best evidence that this constitutes a kind of religion is simply that they themselves often seem to see it that way in the way that they sort of worship previous shooters and kind of see their acts as part of this kind of lineage, right? And as kind of examples of a kind of ritual that they have to, in some cases, explicitly kind of imitate things that previous shooters have done, right? And then, beyond that, I think there's sort of in this, if we wanted to get to the content of this, again, sort of ersatz religion, then, what I argue, which again, I suspect is maybe somewhat controversial, is that what they bring to the fore and make us ask is, what does it mean to possess a sensibility in which you place so little value on life, right? In which you don't value life. Now, I think what's kind of interesting here is that, if there's one thing that we sort of seem to agree on to some extent as a culture, although this comes up, this, actually informs quite a few different culture war debates. It's that there's some intrinsic value to the preservation of life, right? And that this should override other values, right? And people of different persuasions, at least, appeal to this argument in different ways. And, it's a complicated point, but the part of the point I'm making here is if you look at human societies across history, there are often things that are there are often values that are placed above life itself, right? Where it is regarded as not only acceptable, but noble and honorable to give one's own life or sacrifice life in honor of some higher value, right? Whereas this is often something that we're uncomfortable with. An example of this would just be, why do we have so much drone warfare today? Well, basically because the idea that we will be sacrificing our own citizens in wars is no longer as sort of intuitively acceptable to us as it might have been at one point, right? Okay, so that's just an example of this kind of type of value placed on the preservation of life, right? Now, that's not to say that of course we are profligate. I'm not saying that we're actually good at that necessarily, right? There are all sorts of ways that we're profligate about and disregard human life. So that's not the point. The point is that there's an ideological and sort of a kind of secular religious commitment to the idea that nothing overrides the value of life itself, regardless of how well we actually live up to that. So my simple explanation of this religion of the mass shooters is that it is basically just an inversion of that, right? That in the name of not necessarily any particular value, right, life is being destroyed for no particular reason, right? And thereby this kind of value that's placed on life is being inverted, right, or overturned, right? And so it's a kind of dark mirror image of our own, again, not necessarily accurate self-conception of our society as one of people who value the preservation of life. And so what they're doing is, in a sense, just turning that on its head and saying, life is, and the other point here is that the logic of sacrifice historically is not that life is expendable, exactly. In fact, it's that life is valuable, and therefore expending it, like simply destroying it, is an incredibly powerful act, right? Because you're taking something that is, it's equivalent to sort of, I don't know, taking a huge stack of money and lighting it on fire or something like that. You're taking something that is valuable and simply destroying it. And, according to many accounts, this is, or we could think of the Bible, right, where the story of Abraham and Isaac is a sort of, early story of the rejection of human sacrifice and specifically child sacrifice. So the logic of that story, as I understand it, and I think some others do, is that, Isaac is to be sacrificed precisely because he is so precious, right? Because he is the only son. He's the son who's, come to Abraham very late. And so precisely because his life is so valuable, there is no more religiously significant act, right? That transcends the sort of, more utilitarian values of human life than to expend the very thing that is most valuable and render it up to a higher power, right? So, so this is it's a logic that still is difficult for us to comprehend. But I would argue, and other philosophers have argued, that it is really important to understand for trying to make sense of why so many cultures engaged in this, right? And I mentioned, just to finish up this point, I mentioned Georges Bataille, right, who's a very interesting kind of philosopher of religion, and this is at the center of his account of sacrifice, right? That the function of sacrifice is what he calls unconditional expenditure. It's taking the thing that you value and simply consuming or destroying it, right? And the point of this is that this is the means of transcendence because you're overcoming the merely utilitarian, right? You're not taking things and using them in a way that provides direct and immediate functional or practical value to you. Instead, you are creating transcendence by taking these things that you value and kind of rendering them up to something higher. It doesn't really matter necessarily what that is, according to this account. Right now, I think this is where a sort of deeper debate about values comes in, because I think, what we don't tend to discuss or want to discuss is what are the things that we as a culture value above just life itself, right? What are the things that we're willing to, and this came up during the pandemic, right? And that's kind of an interesting point here too. What are the things that we're willing to place above the mere protection or preservation of life? This is a question that I think most of us are pretty uncomfortable with asking. Although perhaps I think secular people are most uncomfortable with asking it, maybe. Religious people may have a clearer way of responding to it, although not necessarily always. But, the point I think about this mass shooting phenomenon that is so kind of is so disturbing about it is that it forces us to kind of recognize this other logic in a quite horrifying way.
Geoff, I'm curious, your piece in particular didn't go into specific policy relating to mass shootings, but I kind of have two lines of questioning for you. I'm curious how you think that, the sort of the do something mentality, whether it's in the form of gun control or red flag laws, how does that fit into this concept of mass shooting as, ritual human sacrifice, perhaps as, our response to wanting to be cleansed of, this incident, which we all find rightfully, hateful, disgusting, sort of, there's a need for us culturally to purify ourselves. So one, how do the calls to do something fit in this narrative? And then secondly, what do you make of some of these policy proposals, and are you open to them? Do you think they would help in any meaningful way or not?
Yeah, I think in a sense the tenor of my argument is to say that I believe that it is possible, and I speak from no particular expertise, that and this is also as a point relates to kind of the scarcity and or the relative rarity of these types of events, despite their significant cultural significance, right? So I think, and that's also another point about why I argue this is a religious phenomenon, is that in the scheme of like gun violence in the United States, it represents maybe something like 1% of fatalities, according to one statistic I saw, right? But nevertheless, it has become the central way we comprehend this issue. Okay, so my sense is that on one hand, that tells us that the centrality of this is fundamentally cultural and as I argue, religious rather than sort of practical, right? And that's why, in some ways, I think as a sort of policy issue, it could be or it can be misleading, right? Because it does not represent the typical or the the most common form of firearm fatality, right? And so what does that mean? Well, it means that policies that just have to do with firearms are, it's possible that they will have some I would imagine that, some reduction in the availability of firearms would make these kind of things less likely. That's probably true. But at the same time, I'm not sure that that's, I think that this issue is so, again, is so atypical in the scheme of gun violence that I'm not sure that's the best frame in which to see it, right? And so, I think, so it's like I'm not necessarily making a case for or against any particular policies in that area. Instead, I'm sort of arguing that there's a need to some extent, reframe the discussion around it in terms of, what its significance is to our culture, rather than, how it's a sort of, or to what extent it's a fixable problem in practical terms, if that makes sense. But I feel like that's sort of a dodge of the question. So, in practical terms, I guess I would say, I think we've seen that, it's interesting. There are countries that, don't have these types of incidents very frequently, but have had some very spectacular instances of them, right? And, to generalize a little bit, in a lot of those cases, the motivation has been much more clearly political, like in the case of like Breivik in Norway, or the Christchurch, New Zealand shooting. So I think, what is specifically American about this is this, particularly these kind of more nihilistic mass shootings that don't even seem to have any particular political content to them. And, to my mind, I just don't really see, I don't see an approach to this that could merely be policy based. I think it has to be understood as a cultural phenomenon, and that means that it has to be grasped, not as something that is. I mean, again, I think there are probably ways the incidents could be reduced, but that it's symptomatic of a deeper crisis that will persist in some form until the sort of underlying causes are reckoned with more fully. So that's probably very pessimistic.
You've hinted at this, I think, in your previous responses, and unfortunately we only have time for one last question. So this is, I think, a kind of a good way to, finish this podcast recording, because I think it's been identified in multiple, I think multiple experts have identified this as an issue, but, and obviously the most recent shooting, and there was one several days before that in Buffalo. It's largely, amplified by the media. And I believe in the Gladwell piece that we previously spoke about, it's also, highlighted in there as kind of a component of this entire conversation about how this contagion can occur. So in all of these crises, whether it's, in the case of mass shootings, obviously copycat effect, that's more obvious, but also with COVID, which you write about a lot. You identified how the pandemic led to certain experts being bolstered as celebrities who couldn't be held accountable, right? I'm curious what your thoughts are on how the media can be a variable in maybe, in both of these, they're both crises in their own sense, and in different ways, but where do you see the media playing a role there? Is the copycat effect and the media's role in it, do you think that that's a fair assessment, that it is leading to this contagion?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think historically, yes. There's if anybody's seen the Oliver Stone movie from the 90s, Natural Born Killers, which is kind of an interesting, I mentioned it briefly in my essay on this, but, one of the characters in it, played by Robert Downey Jr., is kind of this, true crime pundit kind of journalist character. And yeah, basically he's represented as kind of glamorizing and, creating this kind of mystique around these figures. And I think historically there is a truth to that. My sense is, I'm not an expert, but, my sense is that there has been some attempt to tone down on this in the coverage, particularly on the way that, that the individuals committing these acts were for a long time kind of singled out and given this aura of, terror and sort of, given a kind of allure, I guess, right? And that's what you see Oliver Stone sort of parodying already, even before like the Columbine incident when he made the film. That there's like this particular kind of media representation that I think contributes to this kind of cult that forms around these figures, and that you have these sort of experts or these sort of specialists in this who may have kind of fed off and fed this phenomenon. I do think that maybe there's been a shift, though, and again, I would like to study this more deeply. I think there's been an attempt to publish fewer pictures of the perpetrators, just kind of create kind of individualize them less, create less of a kind of strong picture of who they are, in an attempt to kind of cut back on this tendency to glamorize them. But I think there's a catch, which is that where the mainstream media sort of tries to pull back from that. In some cases, social media users will kind of themselves jump in and kind of fill in the gaps in a way that was less possible a couple decades ago. And so, I wonder in general, and then the other problem is we still have this sort of, long shadow cast by Columbine and some of the other sort of most notorious incidents. So, I think the media, my sense is that there has been some attempt to improve on this problem. And yeah, I think to me, it's very clear that historically the way that the mainstream media covered these incidents no doubt contributed to their recurrence. And there is no real accountability for that or sense of how to, measure blame for that. And, I think there has been some moderation more recently in that area, although it's also been accompanied by this much greater kind of ideological slanting where, basically the cases that are jumped on are ones that serve some kind of convenient narrative that certain figures in the media want to pursue. And so, in a way, what you have is less like these are just these kind of strange, irrational, outsiders who are committing these heinous acts and who can then kind of be weirdly and kind of perversely glamorized. And more you have, this is like even if they're not particularly clearly an ideological actor, there's a desire to make them into one and treat them as one. So I think, that's shifted a little bit. And, there's probably, there's probably been some improvement in some areas, but also maybe a worsening in other areas, plus the rise of social media, which is making it possible for, again, these kind of cults of like this perverse celebration around these figures to kind of spring up on social media sites and, various kind of dark corners of the internet.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Geoff. And for listeners, any piece that Geoff mentioned, including the compact piece that we've been talking about throughout the episode, that will be included in the show notes. But if people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you, where can they find you, Geoff?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at daily_barbarian. And I'm also, I maintain a blog and sort of semi-infrequent podcast called Outsider Theory at outsidertheory.com. And that's also on Twitter at Outsider Theory. And yeah, generally I'm writing for Compact, sometimes for Unheard, and the Washington Examiner and a couple of other outlets. So you can find me there.
Great. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.